Greetings, Connecting Point. We are picking up our journey through 1st and 2nd Samuel with chapter 23 of 1 Samuel this week. And I wanted to start you off with a table talk this week. And I wanted to ask you to talk about what is the value of a friend to start off. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes for that. Okay, so last week, Nicole took us through the beginning of David's wilderness years, and we're going to see him off fully into the wilderness this week in chapter 23. And she led us through how his character flaws started to come through as he was operating from a place of desperation, as Saul is chasing him around and he's dealing with the aftermath of the massacre of the priests at Nob. We also saw that David had already started to accrue kind of a band of men who were following him, a rather motley group, and that he was responsible for a few hundred people at this point. Nicole was able to foreshadow David's future failures by planting some seeds, such as David showing himself a little more willing to lie than we might be entirely comfortable with. But our story this week is going to focus on David's successes as a general, as a leader, and we're really going to see a contrast between his leadership style and Saul's. Saul's going to be a failure and David's going to be a success. One of the themes that we've been tracking in this story since David entered the picture is the movement of God's Spirit from Saul to David. Saul had been blessed by God at first. He'd prophesied with the prophets. He'd experienced successes on the battlefield. He was in good standing with Samuel. But we saw last week how Saul's pride and self-focus had become huge stumbling blocks for him. We're going to see more of the same this week. So let's start by reading through chapter 23. I'm reading from the NET translation. They told David, "The Philistines are fighting in Keilah and are looting the threshing floors." So David asked the Lord, "Should I go and strike down these Philistines?" The Lord said to David, "Go, strike down the Philistines and deliver Keilah." But David's men said to him, "We were afraid while we are still here in Judah. What will it be like if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" So David asked the Lord once again. But again the Lord replied, "Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." So David and his men went to Keilah and fought the Philistines. He took away their cattle and thoroughly defeated them. David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Now, when Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had fled to David at Keilah, he had brought with him an ephod. When Saul was told that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, "God has delivered him into my hand, for he has boxed himself into a corner by entering a city with 2 barred gates." So Saul mustered all his army to go down to Keilah and besiege David and his men. When David realized that Saul was planning to harm him, he told Abiathar the high priest, "Bring the ephod." And then David said, "O Lord, God of Israel, your servant has clearly heard that Saul is planning to come to Keilah to destroy the city because of me. Will the leaders of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? O Lord, God of Israel, please inform your servant." And then the Lord said, "He will come down." David asked, "Will the leaders of Keilah deliver me and my men into Saul's hand?" And the Lord said, "They will deliver you over." So David and his men, who numbered about 600, set out and left Keilah. They moved around from one place to another. When told that David had escaped from Keilah, Saul called a halt to his expedition. David stayed in the strongholds that were in the desert and in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul looked for him all the time, but God did not deliver David into his hands. David realized that Saul had come out to seek his life. At that time, David was in Horesh in the wilderness of Ziph. And then Jonathan, son of Saul, left and went to David at Horesh. He encouraged him through God. He said to him, "Don't be afraid, for the hand of my father Saul cannot find you. You will rule over Israel, and I will be your second in command. Even my father Saul realizes this." When the two of them had made a covenant before the Lord, David stayed at Horesh, but Jonathan went to his house. Then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Isn't David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, south of Jeshimon? Now at your own discretion, O king, come down. Delivering him into the king's hand will be our responsibility." Saul replied, "May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go and make further arrangements, determine precisely where he is and who has seen him there, for I am told that he is extremely cunning. Locate precisely all the places where he hides and return to me with dependable information. Then I will go with you. If he's in the land, I will find him among all the thousands of Judah." And so they left and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon in the Rift Valley to the south of Jeshimon. Saul and his men went to look for him, but David was informed and went down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. When Saul heard about it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, while David and his men went on the other side of the mountain. David was hurrying to get away from Saul, but Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to capture them. But a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Come quickly, for the Philistines have raided the land." And so Saul stopped pursuing David and went to confront the Philistines. Therefore that place is called Selah Hamahleketh. And then David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of En-Gedi. A lot of geography in this text as David is leading Saul on a not-so-merry little chase around the southern part of Israel. We'll take a look at a map in a second. But one of the first things that jumps out to me as I look at this text is that you see very strongly that chiastic structure being employed yet again in these stories. So we're going to use this parallel structure. Remember, the chiasm has the beginning and the end have parallel ideas, and then as you go into the text, ideas are paralleled on either side of the center point, and the center point of the text ends up acting as the main idea. So we'll use this parallel structure to zero in on some of those plot elements before we come back to that main point in the center of the story, and that we opened up with, this idea of friendship. So bookends, we open and close with some shared elements between the opening little segment, first couple verses, and the final verse or two. David and his men are on the move, and we see a battle with the Philistines being a key both at the beginning and the end. So let's take a look at that map of southern Israel to see where we're talking about. We learned last week that David had been in Moab, which is east of the Jordan River, to get his family settled out of the reach of Saul's grasp. This week we find out that David and his men have moved into the territory of Judah, and they're actually going to end up all the way across the very western end of Judah, which is near Philistine territory at Keilah. Keilah is close enough to Philistine territory and far enough from other Hebrew settlement at the time that the Philistines might have been guessing that Saul and his army, the proper regular army of Israel, wouldn't be roused to go and help, especially with something like a civil war threatening Israel, as David and his band are possibly beginning to look something like a rival power block to Saul's power base, which, as we saw last week, Saul had focused his his privilege and position on the Benjamites, or his ability to grant privilege and position on the Benjamite tribe. So as the story progresses, David and his men are fleeing southeastward through some of the bleak lands in the wildernesses of Judah. First to Horesh, where we see that key moment where he meets Jonathan for the last time, and then on to Ziph and Maon. Of particular, and finally in En-Gedi, which is where David ends up spending a lot of his wilderness time, is down in that southern wasteland near the Dead Sea. So of particular interest as you look at this map is that David's whole part in this story takes place in Judah, which is of course his own tribal territory. He's a Judahite, and he probably and he is working in and around people who could maybe be expected to be sympathetic to him, as they are his tribesmen. So we read about these two battles on either end. Battle number one is David and his small band of troops going into Keilah to support this city that's been besieged by the Philistines. So in this first case, David willingly takes this band of soldiers who don't have a ton of economic base or support into a battle against the enemies of God, because David is faithful. He's inquiring of the Lord whether or not they should go into battle, and he receives an affirmative answer twice from God. So it's this response of faithfulness and willingness to risk both his safety and the safety of his men, because it is a righteous thing to do. David is showing the right way to respond to threats. So David ends up turning this battle into a successful counter raid. It says he stole all the Philistine livestock. The Philistines had, I guess, they had brought the livestock in either as a feast for the end of the battle after they won the raid, or maybe to eat up the crops that had been planted in and around the town of Keilah. So, but here we see the raiders end up plundered. To contrast that, the second battle, we see a very different response from the other leader. Saul is reluctantly broken from his pursuit. He reluctantly breaks off his pursuit of God's chosen one, David, in order to do his kingly duty, right? So as opposed to David willingly going into battle on behalf of God, Saul is dragged away from his personal vendettas. Saul's actions are driving Israel quickly into yet another disastrous civil war. Recall that we're only 2 or 3 generations removed from the end of the book of Judges, which ends with a disastrous civil war, also featuring the Benjamites. But Saul is providentially stopped from pressing home against David and David's men by the threat of a Philistine raid. So these bookends lead me to consider this role of providence in the way that the world works. The idea of providence is that God plays a role in all human events, whether actively or passively, in seeing his will done. Nothing escapes the notice of God. And whether human agents intend things for good or for ill, right, in our story today, David is intending things for good. He's intending things to be done according to God's will. But Saul is not. Saul is out for his own purposes and his own out-of-control revenge plots. But whatever the motives of the human agencies at work, God is going to be the one in control. I think often in my life, I don't really pay enough attention to how God is at work kind of subtly and in the circumstances around me, sometimes leading me actively or sometimes just passively sparing me from things. But I would wager that if you are you ask around with your group, whoever you're with, what have you experienced of God's providence in your life? You'll be bound to get some interesting stories, thinking about God either actively moving and leading, or sometimes intervening directly, or sometimes just passively, sparing you from stuff, right? Where you realize later on that the circumstances were such that you were spared some sort of harmful, conclusion or harmful consequence for something. So I want you to take a moment to table talk around this and share a story. Can you share a story of either being led to something or of being spared from something that you might attribute to God's providence? All right, having briefly looked at these battles as the bookends of our story, we can turn our attention into those bigger inside sections that talk about the movement of David's troops, and David himself, of course, across Judah. So I see 3 shared kind of thematic elements between both sides of this story. The first one I see is religion. And so this is, you see this with David correctly applying to God for help twice, both when he's going to raid the Philistines who are attacking Keilah, and then later for whether he needs to flee from Keilah or not. David applies to God for help. He asks God, should I go in? What should we do? When the men say, I don't know, we're feeling a little bit worried, he goes back to God and says, seriously, God, should we do this? And God gives them this affirmative answer. When they're in Keilah, Abiathar has shown up and met up with them. Abiathar's one of the priests who fled from Nob. He's the only priest who survives the massacre that Doeg led in the previous story from last week. And Abiathar shows up with the ephod, which is a kind of a religious garment that the Israelites were using at the time to try to understand God's will. So David, though, uses Abiathar correctly. He doesn't use him. He goes to him and asks for advice and asks for help understanding the will of God. David's willing to be led. On the contrast, on the other side of the story, you see Saul trying to appropriate the name and the blessings of God to use as tools to manipulate people into doing his bidding, right? You see him say to the Ziphites, oh, God will bless you if you help me, and we're going to go and get David, right? And it's all just a ploy, right? Saul's not interested in what God's will is. He's interested in his will, interested in achieving his revenge, right? So we see these two different ways that these leaders are applying like the promises and the affectations, I guess you could say, of religion. David using them correctly. The second thing that we see is movement, the movement itself. David is able to escape from Saul first at Keilah by leaving early, and then later by fleeing across the wilderness, also leaving before it might have been prudent. It's possible that what you're seeing in verses 25 and 26 is David making something like a tactical error, as he's, like, one of the commentaries I read was saying that it's possible David's running away from like a hilly, high stronghold position as Saul and his army are approaching from below. So if David had been holding this position, he could have been expected to stay and fight and probably have an upper hand in kind of a early Iron Age warfare. It's not a really wise move to attack someone who's got higher ground and has managed to make it an entrenched position. So maybe it's a wrong strategic or tactical decision, but it does seem to be the right theological and moral decision to run away from Saul and his men and not to force the issue and press the battle upon Saul, which would have opened the country back up into a civil war. The phrase used at the end of the text to describe the place of that escape is suggestive that it was a very close shave and that the Philistine raid came at just the right time, that providential time, to spare Israel from a disaster. So the last point that I want to raise is this idea of the treachery of the Judahites. So both Keilah and Ziph show faithlessness to David, even though David first rescues Keilah and then probably should have expected a little more sympathy from Ziph. But Ziph seems to be quite willing to throw their own kinsmen under the bus in order to gain favor with Saul. Ziph is a city that's traditionally associated with Caleb, who is Joshua's right-hand man, and so they possibly have their own, whatever you want to say, tribal ambition or something like that. So what you might be seeing here is intra-tribal conflict or politics rearing its head. Hey, we can get rid of this powerful young guy from the tribe and then we'll be in the charge. I don't know. It's unclear exactly what's going on. David probably should have been able to expect to be able to move freely amongst his own kinsmen, but he cannot. He's on the run, and his own tribe has now been mustered against him. So one of the things that we discover later on in your Bible is that Psalm 54 is actually written as a response to this whole episode when the Ziphites go to inform Saul against David. So let's take a quick look at this psalm. It's only 7 verses. O God, deliver me by your name. Vindicate me by your power. O God, listen to my prayer. Pay attention to what I say. For foreigners attack me. Ruthless men who do not respect God seek my life. Look, God is my deliverer, and the Lord is among those who support me. May those who wait to ambush me be repaid for their evil. As a demonstration of your faithfulness, destroy them. With a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. Surely he rescues me from all trouble, and I triumph over my enemies. Psalm 54 follows a really tight chiastic format as well. If you look at it, verses 1 and 7 have rhymed ideas. Verses 2 and 6 also do. 3 and 5, of course, would then also have a rhyming idea. And then verse 4 acts as that center point, talking about God as the deliverer. And I think this is a really interesting poem to parallel with our story today, as it parallels the text kind of broadly with these themes of fleeing from evil and from being delivered by God. And it kind of draws our attention to that middle point to look at God being the deliverer. In our story, we see a similar sequence, but I want you to notice who is the person who steps in to remind David of God's faithfulness in that short, small little section. We have Jonathan enter into the picture. to kind of draw David's attention back to God. Now, I'm deeply indebted to Eugene Peterson's beautiful book on the life of David. It's called Leap Over a Wall. As we explore the friendship of David and Jonathan just a little further, Jonathan gets such a short little moment in this story, but he plays a really beautiful, ultimately he plays a tragic role in David's narrative. And I think Jonathan really is a significant character in the story. He does something super important for David. One of the big differentiators between Saul and David is that Saul doesn't have someone like a Jonathan in his life. Jonathan's really an equal to David, right? He has a claim to the throne. He's a military champion of the Hebrews. He takes faith in God seriously. But Jonathan has no desire to take advantage of these privileges to further his claims for position or power. Jonathan is in many ways the servant-hearted man that Saul was always supposed to be as the leader of the people. Jonathan's love for David, his loyalty to David, and his focus on making God the center of their friendship, I think they really help to keep David human. There's a lot of opportunity as David's on the run in these horrific circumstances with all these guys looking to him for leadership and guidance. I think there's a lot of opportunity for David to give in to what would be easier or more sensible from a world's perspective if his only goal were to attain the throne that he'd been promised. But I think Jonathan really helps to keep David focused on doing things the right way. Later on in the David narrative, we're going to see that David is becoming more influenced by people who are encouraging him to be more cynical or political in the way that he treats kind of the people around him. But at this point, Jonathan really grounds David in a thoroughly theological understanding of the promises he's been made. And I think it's in large part because of Jonathan's friendship and his influence that David is able to write a psalm of trust like Psalm 54. I want to close us out today by thinking a little bit more about what we can learn from Jonathan's role. We don't see much of him in this text, but I think he's such a significant part of the story. We face so many circumstances in our own lives where we're treated as a means to an end, or where we're stuck treating someone else as a means to an end. And it's not always an avoidable or incorrect thing, right? Not every relationship can be a deep friendship. But what we see in the story of David and Jonathan is kind of an example of what true friendship can be like. David and Jonathan aren't looking to use each other. They've been given the luxury of the time and space and this leisurely mentality where when they're living in Saul's palace together, to get to know one another, to get to know each other's kind of inner struggles, their secret hearts. And what we see from them is that they're both secure enough not to seek to exploit the privileged information that they have about each other at the other's expense. They both seek each other's welfare and well-being. I love that Jonathan doesn't just seek his own advantage with David. He actually tries to call David to live out the godly purpose that David is supposed to have. And he does this even while he's working in such difficult circumstances. Right? Jonathan really has difficult circumstances that he's trying to live out this friendship in. He's got a father who wants to kill this best friend of his, and Jonathan's stuck in the tug of war of loyalties between the two men. Ultimately, his familial loyalty to Saul is going to force him away from his friend as David escapes out into the wilderness, and Jonathan has responsibilities back at Gibeah and in Saul's court. But Jonathan nonetheless is going to continue to try to work for both of their good. And I think you see in Saul and David's responses to Jonathan some indication of the quality of their souls. David's being a more expansive and generous soul that's more gripped by the faithfulness of Jonathan and the faithfulness in his own life. And so David is able to respond to Jonathan's call here in the center of our story today with that psalm of faithfulness and of trust in God's ultimate provision of rescue and of God being his defender. A couple weeks back, we saw Saul's soul on display as he became murderous even towards his own son, as Jonathan was trying to advocate for his friend in the court. And I think this deposit of friendship that Jonathan makes is really formative for David, and it really brackets and contains a lot of the evil that was possible. David had to have been tempted to treat Saul as Saul was treating him, right? Just to seek to end him. But David's retreat from Saul shows that David is really more concerned with doing the right thing than the easy thing, right? And with doing the godly thing than with doing the easy thing. David's retreat from Saul lands him and his men in the wilderness, and David is going to need a very large reserve of faith and strength of character to persist in treating Saul righteously, especially as his own men start to say, why are you sparing Saul? And we're going to be seeing some examples in the coming weeks where David is actually going to have Saul at his mercy. The good that is done by the friendship between David and Jonathan, I think, is a large part of what spares David from becoming another Saul, right? From taking power himself, seizing it, and then being as ruthless as Saul is trying to be. Doug spoke a couple weeks back about this long-term redemptive arc for Saul's family too, as David remembers his covenant with Jonathan's son after Saul and Jonathan have both died, and we're going to see those stories in the weeks upcoming. But David is going to remember that old covenant, and he is going to be able to offer mercy to Jonathan's family, and Saul's family is actually going to get to persist, even though they should expect to be all killed as a regime change happens. It's a very typical thing in the world of kings, right? Eugene Peterson suggests that we don't often think about friendship as being sacramental or sacred in the way that we do prayer or fasting or reading the scripture, but he suggests that it might well attain towards something of this same status. Peterson says that the real friendship, when you experience it, takes the common and the mundane in our human experiences and it turns it into something holy. C.S. Lewis makes similar arguments in his book, Four Loves, which he ends up putting friendship in between kind of affection, which he says is kind of this downward facing love to people below you in some way, children perhaps. And then he brackets it with marital love, which is a different thing. Friendship is a different type of a quality than either of these loves that we have and that we rightly exercise in our lives. But friendship brings out something different about us. And it makes sense on some level that this idea of a non-needy and generous attitude with a peer, right, with someone who we can see as an equal, would be key to bringing out certain aspects of God's image in us, right? We're not having to be in charge, and we're not in this really highly pressured situation that comes about with like the marital relationships, and uniquely pressured. Lewis provides a wonderful exploration in Four Loves for describing how a good friendship really expands the other person, right? It leads them to understand themselves more deeply, and it allows you to understand yourself more deeply as you offer friendship, right? And he talks about how, unlike marital love, which has this exclusivity that's baked into marriage, right? And rightly so. Friendship can expand to include others, and he gives this example of how, like, if you have a group of friends, and say one of them dies, what happens is that you lose not just that friend, but you lose the part of everybody else in the group that is brought out because that friend is there. And you can all think of that the way that your behavior dynamics change because of friends, and change with friends. Peterson wraps up one of his segments in his section on David and Jonathan by stating that it is a wonderful thing to be a Jonathan. And I really love this thought. I think it's a really challenging thing for me to think about. What about Jonathan's character can I work to emulate, right? Jonathan is, he's put in this position of privilege as the king's son, but he recognizes what God is doing in someone else. And instead of trying to squash that, or instead of feeling threatened by that or something like that, what he does for David is he encourages David in that path. And he encourages David to meet his ultimate purpose and potential, I think. And I think that's a huge part of the story of David is this friendship. So I want to leave you with a table talk to think about this question a little bit more. Is there anyone in your life that you think you need to be a Jonathan to? And how can you do this more faithfully and generously?